Welcome, everyone. Hopefully the content has been interesting and entertaining. I'm going to be your moderator today. I'm Heather House. I am really happy to be back home in Central Texas. I'm from Austin, and my family has been in Central Texas since before Texas was Texas, when we were flying under another flag. So I am particularly interested and passionate about the health of our cities in Texas. So this is very exciting for me. I'm going to go ahead and bring up Jen Sanders. Jen Sanders is the executive director and co-founder of the Dallas Innovation Alliance. What? I will in a minute. Thank you.
Oh, you want me to say?
Oh, you can say.
Okay. All right.
And Kathleen Bayreuther, who is a senior manager of the Smart Mobility Solutions at Ford. All right. Before we get started, I'm going to kick off with a couple slides. First off, if you were in my last panel, you heard me talking about this 29 gigaton carbon emission gap that we have. I always like to start every conversation with why it's important. We have to be moving faster than we think so that we can close this gap for the health of our cities. So how do we do that? We start with mobility. The mobility of the future is going to be, which we all have heard, shared, electric, eventually autonomous, and cities designed for it. And then we want to be taking this approach where we're thinking about human-centered cities. So having bikeways, having walkways, having spaces just to sit and enjoy your space with people. We also don't want to be thinking about just scooters or just EVs, but where's the conversation with public transit? That needs to be a big part of the conversation. And so I know most of you probably like pictures. We were just talking about wanting to have some photos earlier. So I included a couple best practices to look at. This is a street in Copenhagen that was transformed from an old automobile street into now a pedestrian-friendly area. This is a Superblock converted into a public space in Barcelona. So these massive blocks that just get transformed from auto domination to human productivity. Prague also has a great example of the community engagement process, really bringing everyone in the city, filling out the room like this, and understanding what the community wants and having that at the heart of design process. Also, Mexico City has ciclovias, which are these days where they give streets back to people, so they get the cars off of the roads. We see that in Austin every Friday and Saturday night on 6th Street. We give the streets back to the people. And then you heard me talk about earlier RMI's mobility hub. We transformed a dead parking space over in East Austin into now an economically viable area where we brought in people from the local community to have businesses, created broadened greenery, created shading so that people could actually have a space to enjoy being. So with that, I wanted to, of course, end with an example of what bad design looks like so that we can also keep that in mind for our conversation. So I wanted to start off, we did have a little bit of conversation in the last panel around scooters, but I really wanted to bring the insight from these two in. Cities are grappling what to do with them. We want affordable options, but we also don't want them littering our streets. So can you both talk a little bit about what this shift looks like from your perspectives?
Well, sure. Well, I think so a lot of you probably followed in Dallas about a year and a half ago when all of a sudden overnight we had thousands of dockless bikes that just appeared downtown. It was before it was permitted. It was before, this was a very much forgiveness, not permission experiment. And Dallas had been back and forth on what to do about bike share for years and not really moved forward. And I said, how appropriate that in Texas, this has become a free market approach and kind of this Wild West approach to how do we get this going. So what I think the unsung hero we were talking about in the midst of this kind of experimental process was the data that was shared by these companies back with the city. Because part of the challenge for years in Dallas was, why would we invest in the infrastructure necessary for biking and now scooters? Dallas doesn't want it. The citizens don't want it. Why would we build it? And there was this rumbling of, yes, we do, but there was no data really to support it. And so as we got that data and that latent demand that had been right there with the ridership really came to the forefront. And so therefore now there's a higher prioritization in using bond money for these protected bike lanes, and to really understand that first mile and last mile in underserved parts of Dallas, the bikes were being used. And so really that this was a viable solution to a lot of the challenges that our residents are facing, no matter what part of Dallas they reside in.
Great, and Kathleen, Ford just acquired Spin. How is Ford thinking about integrating services into the community?
So, as Heather mentioned, I'm on the mobility side of Ford. So we do make trucks, as you probably know, and we've started branching out pretty dramatically. So Ford Mobility is more a mix of software and other services that are not necessarily auto-centric. It's about the smart world around the vehicles. So scooters we see as a part of the first last mile set of solutions that we can help deliver. Sharing data back to cities is, of course, important. And then we also have a subsidiary called Transloc, which works with transit agencies to design microtransit programs that are actually run by the agencies. So we can simulate where microtransit might be the most effective. We can also look at what the scooters are doing naturally, work with the cities to deploy a set of solutions that can all be stitched together in a way that works for them.
Also, I wanted to ask, going back to city design, when we are looking at the design of our cities now, they are very much car-centric. So I kind of wanted to ask, what is the importance of human-centered design and also the community input process around getting there?
Do you want to start out?
Sure. So I don't know how many folks here would have seen Jim Hackett's talk at CES last year. He's the CEO of All Ford, but he was actually at Steelcase for a very long time. And his big emphasis is around user-centered design. We have actually an entire team out in Palo Alto. A lot of them are ex-IDEO folks. I'm looking at what does it mean to take the person out of the car and operate in cities, and what does it mean for cities not to be car-centric. But then any other future mobility solutions should also reflect sort of that user experience. So we have a lot of different products and services that have that at the center of their the ethos, and a lot of things coming out of that design group that we're still working on that'll be launched over the next few years. But one of the actual services we started offering cities is something called the City of Tomorrow Challenge. So we actually have a team that works with cities to do public engagement around mobility, bringing different neighborhoods to the center and actually talking about placemaking and design thinking as it relates to mobility. So we've done everything from going to cities and do work with the cities around design thinking and launching new products, all the way to actually trying to bring that ethos into the new products that we are developing.
So I think if most cities that I talk to will admit that they are not, citizen engagement is not their strongest skill set, right, in terms of doing that effectively. And so one of the Dallas Innovation Alliance, so we're a freestanding 501c3 P3 that works with the city of Dallas and 36 partners across sector. And part of the function that we has been part of our mission from day one is how do we engage the community to educate them, to listen, to understand what their concerns are around the integration of data and technology and what they want to improve quality of life. So engaging with thousands of residents and trying to be a resource to the city and to entities in the private sector is such a critical piece, again, of that planning process. And we heard that in the last panel around making sure that there's an inclusive nature to that. I think in terms of livability and walkability and quality of life, the shifting is happening quicker than I think Dallas expected in terms of being so car-centric. You're never going to get folks out of their trucks. And I never want them to get out of their trucks, Kathleen. We'll always need trucks. We're always going to need trucks. But I think in terms of, so the downtown density in Dallas, when I moved here in 2005, there were less than 1,000 residents. There are 12,000 now, and there's 14,000 units under construction, residential, in the downtown core. And so the needs are changing, the demands are changing, and those squeaky wheels are starting to cause the strategy to shift in terms of how downtown's being redesigned, what the sidewalk widths look like, what the lane usage looks like. Curbside, I think we're going to talk about shortly. But the role of a downtown public improvement district is something that I think can't be overstated, because they can move autonomously, they have their own budgets, they can focus in a very micro way in terms of what are their needs of that specific part of the city, and then allow that to move out. So what we've seen is our downtown PID taking a really central leadership role in creating that sense of place and quality of life, and shifting how downtown is designed, and then letting other parts of the city leverage those learnings.
One thing, if I could just double down, so Jen mentioned listening and also how the work gets done. A lot of what my team and I are focused on is actually listening to the needs of cities and making sure that any what that we deploy actually is congruent with what the city's priorities are. But we could all be aligned, and it could still be very hard to actually move a project forward. And so some of what we've learned, I think, in partnering with each other as well as in other communities is, what does it mean to not just identify a solution that everyone's aligned around, but also deploy it in a way that is as rapid as it needs to be? Because municipal budget planning and these cycles and actually finding the funds for these new solutions, there's a years plus long lag on a lot of those things. And so how can we be innovative, and how can we work with existing institutions to be more nimble and try new things out and get them tested quickly and then iterate as a coalition of public and private partners? And so I think the what is only a piece of this. People ask me mostly about the what are you working on? It's more about how we deploy it in cities in concert with their priorities.
And I think to that end, it's about taking that quick response and being proactive, not reactive, right? But you also have to take the long view as well, because I think part of the problem, you could argue it's election cycle timing, you could argue the instant gratification nature of all of us, myself included. But if you're not taking a generational look ahead strategically, we're never going to get there. So I think it's the balancing of the long view and planning for, with the need to really be very, very responsive is something that I think is really, really challenging for folks to do. Yeah.
Great, I'll just let y'all take it from here. So one thing that Jen mentioned was curbs, and kind of got me thinking, we're near one of the most well-known battleground sites in Texas. And I started thinking, what is that battleground site for mobility? And it really is the curb. Car lovers, urbanists, everyone is fighting over the curb space right now. So would you two talk a little bit more about that battleground, why it's so important, what's going on around the curb?
So from a placemaking standpoint, I think as there's an increased desire for walkability and potential for littering of sidewalks and pieces like that, there's obviously a need to look at curb maintenance and placemaking. There's an organization based in Dallas but has done work all over the world called Better Block. Have any of y'all heard about Better Block? Yep, we've got some nods, some not. So they do kind of guerrilla placemaking, working with communities and saying, okay, this intersection feels unsafe to you, we're going to create these bump outs and these new crosswalk concepts and various things. But what they really do is illustrate the change that communities want, and in some cases, why current zoning policies are antiquated. So saying, this is what people want, the world didn't explode, maybe we should really take a serious look at changing these zoning and permitting policies, for example. And so I think as we look at the shared economy, obviously curb management is going to be more and more critical to not create double parking situations and further congestion.
Yeah, so the curb, right now, we think of it as a place where cars are just hanging out. Over time, as vehicles are in service of a fleet, they'll be in constant motion. There's no value for a fleet operator to have the vehicle sitting in one place for a long period of time, unless it's being serviced, right? So the goal for the operators will be to keep those vehicles in motion. The goal for the city is to reduce congestion and create throughput. And right now what you'll see is cars parked on a curb, and then you'll see loading and unloading of Ubers and Lyfts. If you also think about freight delivery as an extension of all of this, so like micro logistics, first last mile logistics, what's happening in cities with all of these subscription services, Amazon Prime, like this layer of the goods movement on top of the people movement, cities are really experiencing a ton of congestion, and they're really motivated to not only police the curb, but use curb management as a way to alleviate congestion. You don't want people circling looking for a bay to do their loading and unloading, for example. So in the transit world, there's a standard called GTFS, which actually is one of the ways in which agencies can share their schedules. And they're basically there's a coalition of companies working together to actually create standards for the curb, so that cities and companies can actually come together on not just articulating what the curb looks like from a data standard perspective, but also characterizing it and then being able to direct vehicles, goods, and services to the right place on the curb so that the city can actually enforce how that space is being used. Because that really is the last thing the city can regulate to shape how all these new types of mobility are actually being deployed in their domain.
How do you see autonomous vehicles affecting the curb, or vice versa, the curb impacting autonomous vehicles?
So right now there's a lot of ways that we know where to put a vehicle, right? But the vehicle's not being driven. You're programming that capability into the vehicle. So there's all kinds of characterizations like curb cuts that we have Google Maps, but Google Maps can't direct you to a curb cut for an ADA compliant autonomous vehicle pickup or drop off. Right now, most of those are actually in crosswalks, so these two things are at odds. So you have all these instances where if you were to run through a series of use cases, and I really like the previous discussion because those extreme use cases are super informative for what it means to design for an AV future. It's a while out, but we have to actually create a characterization system so that the vehicles can learn about the environment over time. So not just visualizing it and mapping it, but also characterizing it so that there's consistency.
Great, so one of the pieces of this mobility revolution that is not often talked about is behavioral economics. You know, you told Kathleen, you know, about trucks. We would like everyone to shift into mobility services and into autonomous vehicles, use scooters, walk, don't drive. But there's something that ties down to our core about cars and driving them. How do we change people's opinions and get them out of cars?
I mean, the major piece with mass transit, I think, is mass transit has to be as easy to use as someone getting into their car solo to get where they're going. And so some of that is about dynamic route response and creating those efficiencies. I mean, and I'm guilty of it. You know, I'd love to say that I'm 100% mass transit rider, and I'm not. And part of that is just the routing, that if it's going to take me 3 times as long to get to a meeting via mass versus my car, I'm going to get in my car. I have the luxury to do so. So I think it's adapting route response and methods of mass transit. I think it's knitting together, to your point, the end-to-end data sharing and scheduling. But ultimately, it's, in my mind, especially in a state like Texas, we're looking at a generational change. Would you agree?
Yeah, I mean, companies like mine have worked a really long time to make it a habit that is sticky for you to drive in your vehicle by yourself. And so there's a lot of years of that habit to undo. But I think as cities change, or organizing cities around people is a good opportunity to make driving a less attractive way to move around, either because it's expensive or because it's a lot slower to drive and park than it is to just ride a scooter or walk or take transit.
And you're totally right. Ford has a great sticky message and marketing around automobiles. Has Ford Smart Mobility thought at all about the marketing side? And I mean, marketing is not my background, but the little that I have read is that, I mean, we're really changing habits. We're looking for this one breaking point that we can pinpoint and reward with whatever we want them to do, which in this case is use new mobility. Have y'all thought at all about the marketing messaging around how to do that?
I'm sure there are a lot of people above me who think a lot about that. I would say more of our energy is focused on what does it mean to get it right when you're working with partners. So there's marketing in terms of like a glossy brochure, but then there's actually delivering on a message of partnership. And that's what my team and I spend most of our time on.
And I would just say the consumer-facing message is irrelevant unless the infrastructure and the operational can fulfill it. And so I think it's a little bit of chicken egg in my mind.
Definitely.
Yeah.
So from both of your perspectives working in this field, has there been anything that's been really surprising that did work, didn't work, that was just a botch that you thought was going to be a great pilot? Love to learn from best practices and worst practices. I don't think we share worst practices enough.
I don't think so either, but I should have given that more thought in the context of the mobility side. I mean, I'll just, 2 quick examples, which actually are not things we've done because we're early in the mobility execution. So another city did smart parking with dynamic pricing, and the level of education to citizens prior to that rolling out was not quite there, and the level of pushback caused them to have to reverse, turn off, you know, and really backpedal heavily on that system, which involved a lot of capital investment. So to me, that just speaks to kind of the theme of this session in terms of how are you engaging citizens, designing it, informing them so there is not this backlash to new technology that really inhibits the value that these projects could have brought. So I'll just stop there.
I think there's a lot of efforts around pilots, and so you see different entities trying to try these new technologies out, but the focus of the conversations tends to be about the technology itself, and maybe how can we use, like the starting point is how do we play with autonomous vehicles, then the second question is where do we put an autonomous vehicle, and the third question is what problem do we want to solve. And so I would say that the most common failure is some mix of leading with the technology solution and then not actually creating a strong enough baseline to measure success.
Shiny object syndrome.
Yeah, so starting with shiny objects, not focusing on use cases, not measuring what the baseline is, not identifying what success looks like, and then probably underestimating the curve to success. So getting people out of their cars is a long-term change. So like actually spending enough time to get it right, I think is one of the things that you run into a lot in both the public and the private sector. Like this transition is going to require an immense amount of patience, and a lot of us lack that. And so I think acknowledging that and setting metrics around that, intentional metrics that are more gradual, would do us all a lot of favors.
Great, so I'm gonna leave a little bit of time for questions, but before I do that, I wanna leave you with one tactic that I learned from community engagement. And when you're asking people questions, it's always nice to end by asking them, what have I not asked you that I should be asking you? What's important that you want to speak to?
I think we should have talked more about the best undergraduate experience in the US. Jen and I went to the same undergraduate institution. So we would like to talk about Thomas Jefferson and UVA.
And Tony Bennett
Exactly,
and March
that's right.
Madness, although not last year's historic upset.
Yeah. So we can take questions on that or mobility. It's up to you guys.
I, Well, I mean, I think the one challenge, which is not going to surprise anyone in this room, but working on solutions to it, obviously, is a role that everyone can play, is around the data sharing between public and private sector, between all kinds of folks, right? And so in our smart parking pilot that we did, it was a mix of public and private lots. And public didn't have any issue with us pulling that data, but the different private lot owners certainly did, you know, in terms of us pulling that in. And so the efficiencies and the results obviously were smaller than they could have been, but how do we work through creating a comfort level in sharing data from a competitive standpoint versus other pieces, and the end-to-end transportation solutions in terms of pulling in all this into a single app? It's a similar challenge. So who owns that, and who's the neutral party that can aggregate that in a way that everyone is comfortable? Because it couldn't be the single entity at the tip of the spear if not everybody can buy into the neutrality of that party.
The only thing I would add from a content standpoint, other than we should talk about UVA more, is that I think there's a lot of opportunity to co-create these solutions right now. So the assumption is the private sector has a very specific perspective, and a lot of these solutions are already completely baked, and we're just going to push them onto you, and your job is to respond to that. And I will tell you that part of why my team exists is that we don't have it all figured out, and a lot of things are changing in real time on our side as well. So I think there's a unique opportunity right now to bring companies together that are all operating the same ecosystem. Like, we're not all at each other's throats. We're actually all figuring out where we're going to play in this ecosystem. There's a lot of opportunities to create those roundtables and co-create solutions with the private sector, and we're not as fiercely competitive as one might assume, because there is a lot that's changing in real time on our side as well.
Well, thank you both. We've got time for about 2 questions. Let's first give them a round of applause. Do we have any mics in the audience? Does anyone want to stand up and shout their question?
No, they're standing mic in the middle.
This is the stress test. Were you listening?
Or we covered everything so well, there's just nothing left to say.
We covered it all.
Yeah.
All right.
All right.
Well, let's give them one more round of applause. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.